Was Helen Pusser really using Dwana's trust fund money to fund her investigation into Buford's death? Stick around and hear the truth. It's around midnight, August 20th, 1974. Buford's had a busy day. Earlier, he had been to Memphis, where he signed a contract to play himself in the sequel to Walking Tall that the studio simply intended to call Buford. That evening, Buford made an appearance at the McNairy County Fair. Then he made his way home, and on his way there, tragedy would strike.
Which has grossed about $50 million, tells the story of a young sheriff in rural Tennessee and his violent fight against the local underworld. The real-life hero was Buford Pusser, whose wife was killed by racketeers and who himself was the target of 7 assassination attempts. Buford Pusser, the father of 3, was killed last night in a highway crash at the age of 36. More on the story from David Dick in Selmer, Tennessee.
One day before he died, Buford Pusser held a news conference to announce he'd signed a $2 million contract to make a sequel to the movie about his life, Walking Tall.
Well, big fight, I'm scared. But I feel somewhat confident about it now after taking screen test.
Shortly after midnight, Buford Pusser was heading home down this road, Highway 64. He was alone in the car. Today, there were long skid marks on the road, and the curious, many of them old friends of Pusser, gathered to look at the place where his car hit the embankment, flipped over, and burned. Pusser was thrown out and killed. Souvenir hunters picked up whatever they could find, like pieces of the windshield. The car was towed to a nearby service station where Pusser's close friend, Roger Horton, looking at the car's broken tie rod, said he had doubts that it was just an accident.
To me, like it's been cut. Looks like to me like it's been damaged. I don't believe it happened in a wreck because it hit sideways. And if it had, it don't look like it would have bothered this.
Tennessee State Police investigating the wreck say they believe the tie rod was broken on impact, but that the case is not closed. The investigation is continuing. David Dick, CBS News, Selmer, Tennessee.
With Buford dead, Carl Pusser just simply wanted to let things end there. He said he didn't want to know if there was a nefarious cause of Buford's death. Helen Pusser, on the other hand, looked at things differently. She had always believed all the tall tales that Buford had told her about the danger that he was always in, so it was easy for her to become convinced that Buford was murdered. Now Larry Britt injects himself into the story. He claimed to be a private investigator, and he preyed on Helen Pusser for the money that he could get out of this. Britt would use Helen's thought to work against her. He would convince her that if Buford had been murdered, he could find out who was behind the plot. So Britt convinced Helen that an investigation of this type and this scale would take money, because a lot of these people that he would want to interview wouldn't want to talk. He would have to buy the information from them, and she fell for it. Of course, Buford had left Helen and Dwana a considerable sum of money in his will. It was put into a trust, and of course there were taxes that had to be paid. Inheritance taxes, federal taxes, state taxes, and Helen had done that. And so she got to looking at the finances and decided the best way to pay Britt was to go into Dwana's trust fund. Now at the time, Dwana's trust fund totaled about $308,000. That was a tremendous amount of money for the mid-70s. Now, Britt, having convinced Helen that he had to pay for informants and the information that they had, well, Helen started giving him money out of Dwana's trust fund. $5,000 here, $2,000 there. It all began to add up. Be sure and subscribe and hit that bell so that you'll get notifications of new videos when they're released. Now I think we can assume that Britt found this to be very easy, getting money from Helen. And so soon things started to increase. He needed money for motels, a car, then another car. It all began to just snowball. You have to keep in mind that Dwana was only in her mid-teens at this time, and she didn't have control over her finances. And it wouldn't be long before she found out what Helen was doing. Unfortunately for Dwana, it was getting late in the game. Britt was spending money from the trust fund like it was just growing on trees. It wasn't long before Dwana's trust fund, that had started out at just over $308,000, was now down to about $8,500, as Britt was paying for all kinds of things. I mean, he and his wife were living there with Helen, and he had started paying his wife for housekeeping, loaning money to his sons, taking care of his wife's beauty appointments with money out of the trust fund. If you want to learn the real story of Buford Pusser, you need to get my book, Buford Pusser, The Other Story. It is full of facts and information that you don't get anywhere else that I know of. It's the story as told by the people who live their own parts in the real tale. It's full of photographs, documents, lots of interesting things to see, and it pretty well outlines everything from Buford's birth up until the time of his death. And even after that, because the family became embroiled in a lot of lawsuits over his legacy. So again, Buford Pusser, The Other Story. It's available at both Amazon.com and eBay. Now it was about this time that McNairy County Chancellor Robert Thomas, while doing an annual review of Dwana's trust fund, he noticed a huge discrepancy that had occurred. Upon seeing a number of disbursements that were very questionable to Larry Britt, he issued an injunction to halt any further spending in that account. Then he wanted to bring Helen Pusser into court to explain why she should not be removed as the guardian of Dwana's estate. Initially, the trust had been set up to allow Helen to only spend $1,000 a month from Dwana's accounts for Dwana's expenses. Seeing that this had been violated, he appointed 2 Selmer attorneys to investigate what was going on and ordered Bing Crosby Productions into court. Chancellor Thomas, concerned about the expenditures that Helen was making from Dwana's trust fund, set a hearing date of November 1st, 1976, to look into this matter, as he was concerned about the expenditures that she was making, especially to the investigator, Larry Britt. And he was equally concerned that Helen wanted to have the body of Buford Pusser exhumed for medical testing. Of course, Helen said that she would resist efforts to have her removed as the guardian of Dwana's accounts. She would go on to say, "I'm taking care of it. I know where it is. They don't need to worry about my business." Then she would go on to say that Larry Britt, her business manager, was taking care of her son's estate, that she controlled him. He did what she said. Now, oddly, as a backdrop to all this court drama, Bing Crosby Productions was wrapping up the third and final of the sequel to Walking Tall. Even as this was taking place, Helen was still contending, along with her private investigator, Larry Britt, that Buford had been poisoned and that she wanted his body exhumed so that they could do the medical testing. Of course, Carl Pusser, Helen's husband, and her other son, John Howard Pusser, did not want the autopsy to be performed, and District Attorney Michael Whitaker had moved to stop the exhumation. Now, as the hearing started in Chancery Court, Larry Britt admitted that he had spent more than $100,000 during his investigation. He was saying that there were men in high places, and it was hard to send these people to prison, that information had to be purchased. He also contended that one of these men was Buford's personal attorney, Lloyd Tatum. Of course, Tatum was angered by the fact that Britt would make such a claim that he was involved in the murder of his friend Buford. But Britt would go on to claim that it was not only Tatum, but his other 2 business partners, along with 7 others, who were guilty of aiding and covering up Buford's murder. Britt would continue to say that there was a 10-man conspiracy that involved tax evasion, fraud, and a politically linked assassination. Now, Britt would tell the court that he had spent $107,000 of the trust fund money for information about his investigation. In the meantime, Dwana Pusser would testify before the court that neither Britt nor Helen spoke for her any longer. As far as she was concerned, she was the only one that was going to speak for herself. Now, as the court pressed for more information about this alleged conspiracy that Britt was talking about, he said that he was engaged with the IRS in looking into this matter, that they were also interested. As the court pressed on, wanting to know more about Lloyd Tatum's co-conspirators, Britt would say that one was Mort Briskin, the other Chuck Pratt, both executives at Bing Crosby Productions. Now, the thing that seemed to be causing Britt the most problem in court was the TBI's findings that Buford's accident was just that, an accident, that Buford was intoxicated that night with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.18. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Britt admitted that he had used funds from the trust fund to purchase 2 vehicles, both Lincoln Continentals. I'm not sure what they had to do with his investigation. As you may recall, I had previously mentioned that Helen was only allowed to spend $1,000 a month for Dwana's expenses. Chancellor Thomas called Aetna Life and Casualty into court as they were the company that was in charge of funding Dwana's trust. Chancellor Thomas wanted to know why, with the limit set at $1,000 a month for expenditures on Dwana's behalf, they had allowed Helen to withdraw so much more. Eventually, they were forced to reimburse Dwana's trust fund. The court would rule that while Helen Pusser would be able to retain the guardianship of the person Dwana Pusser, she would no longer be allowed to handle the affairs of her trust. So now you're probably wondering, what became of Larry Britt? Well, that's going to be in our next episode. Be sure and leave your comments. I want to know what you think about Helen Pusser and her involvement here, as well as that of Larry Britt. So until next time, just remember, truth has no agenda. Thanks for watching.